Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring the stories of two people who ventured into remote cabins in the Appalachian Mountains and ended up experiencing moments of pure panic. The first story really stuck with me. It's something that's never happened to me personally, but I've received several similar accounts and looked into it a bit. And it's a genuinely disturbing world. The second one taps into what I think is one of our most primal fears: the idea of monsters hiding under the bed. Either way, I loved diving into both stories and talking with the people who sent them in. I hope they leave you feeling the same way they left me. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I've gone back and forth for a long time about whether I should even tell this. Mostly because I know how these stories usually sound to people who haven't been through something similar. They're quick to simplify it, to label it as stress or imagination, and then move on. But lately, I've been feeling that same weight again, especially at night. That quiet pressure that makes it hard to relax or fall asleep. And it brought all of this back to the surface. Not as memories exactly, but as a feeling, like something unfinished. So I'm telling it now. Not because I have answers, but because keeping it to myself hasn't helped either. What happened took place about 5 years ago, in the middle of winter, during a short solo trip into the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up around that area, and being out there was never about proving anything or chasing adrenaline. It was familiar, controlled, and honestly one of the few places where I felt grounded. I'd been there before, more than once, and I knew the terrain well enough to feel comfortable even in colder months. At the time, it felt like the safest possible setting for a quiet trip, even though in hindsight, being alone, surrounded by mountains, snow, and absolute darkness probably made everything that followed far worse. So I got everything ready, and as early as possible, I left the house. I parked at a small gravel pull-off, hiked in for maybe 2 hours, and found a spot near a narrow ridge where the trees opened up just enough to see the valley below. It felt right, and if you've camped enough, you know exactly what I mean by that. That instinctive sense that this is where you stop, where you set everything down. The first day was completely normal, and that matters, because nothing felt off at the beginning. I've been in complicated situations before, and usually my instincts are good enough to get me out of trouble. I set up my tent, filtered water from a small stream downhill, and spent the afternoon walking the surrounding area just to get familiar with it. I didn't see anyone, which wasn't unusual. And I didn't hear anything beyond the usual sounds: wind moving through the trees and the occasional snap of branches somewhere far off. By the time it got dark, I was tired in that good way you only get from being outside all day. So I ate, zipped up the tent, and fell asleep faster than I expected. The next day was exactly the same. I went on hikes, listened to the normal, beautiful sounds of the forest. Originally, the idea of the trip was to just camp the whole time, but even though I had plenty of experience doing that, I was also pretty worn out. The months before had been hard. And on top of that, snow in the mountains can be brutal and unpredictable. So about 5 days before I left, I found a cheap little cabin to stay in for 2 nights. After that, I planned to continue the trip, camp one more night, and then head back home. I never even made it to the second night in that cabin. At first, everything was just as normal as before. The cabin was clean, even though it was obvious that no one had been there for long stretches of time. It only had 3 rooms, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small living area with a kitchenette. Everything was pretty tight, but at the same time it felt cozy, like the kind of place meant to keep heat in during bad weather. There were only 2 things that stood out as strange. The first was a locked door that probably led to some kind of third, tiny space. From the outside architecture of the cabin, you could tell there was something there, but it was far too small to be another proper room. I assumed it was just storage, maybe where the owner kept personal items for when they came to visit. Since it was locked, I didn't think much of it. The second thing, which was more noticeable and honestly a bit odd from an architectural point of view, was the layout. The living room and kitchen were at one end of the cabin, then everything narrowed into a long hallway, and at the very end were the bedroom and the bathroom. From the outside, that narrowing wasn't very obvious, and at the time I actually thought it was a good sign, because it probably meant those walls were thick and solid. Still, it was a strange use of space and didn't make a lot of sense. I'm only explaining this to give you a clear picture of the setting where everything happened. I wrapped up my day normally. I took a hot shower, made myself a warm dinner, and then lay in bed reading for a bit, until I fell asleep. Nothing strange. Nothing that would have made me think twice about being there. I woke up in the middle of the night, around 2:30 in the morning, to what I can honestly say was the most terrifying moment of my life. At first, I didn't immediately understand what was happening. I could hear noises, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, everything escalated too fast. The noise grew louder, more intense, and I became aware that there was something in the room with me. I was absolutely certain that whatever it was pressed against the wall in front of my bed, but I couldn't see it. My entire body was paralyzed. I couldn't even move my head. I tried to look down, but all I could make out was a shadow. I tried to speak, but not a single word came out of my mouth. When I say I don't know how long I was in that state of pure panic, I mean it. I genuinely have no idea, and the only thing I know for sure is that it wasn't just a few seconds. I was shaking, drenched in sweat, fully aware of my fear but completely unable to react. When I finally managed to move again, I knew that whatever had been there before was gone. I can't explain how I knew. It was just an absolute certainty inside me, one I still can't put into words. After that, most people probably would have gotten out of bed immediately, even if it was just to prove to themselves that they had control over their body again. I didn't. I stayed there, frozen by fear, trying to process what had just happened and not knowing what to think. I'd had a sleep paralysis episode once before, when I was very young while sleeping at my grandparents' house. That night, I told my grandfather what I'd experienced, and he told me it was a spirit, and that once it grabbed you, it would never let you go. And for years, I lived in absolute terror of it happening again. As time passed, life got busy, and that fear slowly faded into the background. But there I was, lying in that bed, feeling like I'd been thrown back in time, like I was that same terrified kid all over again. I ran through every possible scenario in my head. I could stay there and wait for morning, or I could leave the cabin and try to make my way back home. It was night, and the mountains are full of dangers. I was genuinely afraid to go outside, and just as genuinely afraid to stay. Still, the fear of leaving was stronger, so I stayed put, telling myself that morning would come quickly and I'd get out then. What I didn't know was that it wasn't going to end there. Panic can do two opposite things. It can flood you with adrenaline, or it can completely drain you. In my case, I was utterly exhausted, and despite the fear, I fell asleep again. I woke up once more to absolute terror. I couldn't move, and it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, like there was a crushing pressure inside my chest. I felt like I was screaming, but not a single sound came out. I tried to control the panic, telling myself I was alone in the room, or at least hoping I was. Then, I heard the same noise I'd heard earlier. It was coming from the hallway, and as it got closer, the sound grew louder. I don't know how, but the panic must have been so intense that I managed to slightly turn my head and look at the half-open door leading into the hallway. That only made it worse. The same shadow I'd seen before was still there, growing as the noise increased, until suddenly there was nothing. Just darkness and absolute silence. The next thing I remember is morning. It was snowing outside, and the daylight was harsh and bright. I still don't know exactly what happened, but I think I may have passed out from sheer panic. And believe me, it might not sound that terrifying on the surface, but losing complete control of your body while knowing there's something there with you and being unable to defend yourself is one of my deepest fears. That same day, I left the cabin, and instead of continuing my trip, I headed straight home. As I walked, I could feel the pain in my muscles, all of them tense and sore from the night before. 5 years have passed since then, and nothing like that has happened again. But I don't feel like this story is really over. For a long time afterward, I became obsessed with sleep paralysis, consuming every piece of content I could find about it. It's a truly disturbing world. That obsession has faded, but the fear hasn't. I'm afraid to fall asleep. I panic on the darkest nights, when it feels like my body is sensing something, even though nothing ever happens. It's a miserable way to live, and honestly, I still don't know how to fix it. I've talked to a few people about this, and the opinions are all over the place, ranging from those who think I imagined everything and that it was just a moment of stress, to others who believe there was something in that cabin. I know the first option isn't true, because nothing you imagine leaves you shaking like that, soaked in sweat, with your body aching and completely exhausted afterward. The panic was too real, too physical. I also know the second explanation isn't right either. Whatever it was that came to me in that cabin had already come to me when I was a child. Both times it happened in the Appalachian Mountains, but separated by hundreds of miles. Places so far apart that there's no logical way to connect them. And deep down, I know this isn't over. I know that sooner or later it's going to come back. And I also know that when it does, I won't be ready for it. My name is Peter. I'm 37 years old, and I'm going to tell you something that happened to me 2 years ago, back when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. More specifically in the West Virginia side, where the roads get narrow, the signal disappears, and once it starts snowing, it feels like the rest of the world quietly steps away and leaves you to yourself. I didn't go there looking for trouble, and I definitely wasn't chasing some dramatic experience. I just needed a break from work, from noise, from people constantly needing something from me. And at the time, a quiet cabin in the middle of winter sounded like the most harmless plan in the world. Not to mention it was something I had done countless times throughout my life. Most of the time I was with other people, but I'd also had a few solo adventures in different forests across the US. I found the place online about a month before the trip. It was cheaper than most of the other cabins in the area, which caught my attention right away. But I convinced myself it was because it was January. The owner wasn't rude, but he wasn't exactly warm either. His messages were short, sometimes vague. And when I asked him how often the place was checked during winter, he just said, "It's all set up for guests," which didn't really answer my question. But I let it go, because I didn't want to overthink something that was probably normal. The drive up there was long and quiet. The last stretch of road was barely plowed, and I remember thinking that if something went wrong, I'd be on my own for a while. Still, that didn't scare me, because I've always been comfortable being alone. In fact, I usually feel more balanced when I am. I parked the car in the closest accessible spot and then hiked for about an hour before finally reaching the cabin. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos. Small, wooden, tucked between tall trees that were heavy with snow. There were no other houses in sight, just endless white and dark trunks stretching into the distance. The cabin had a small living area with a compact kitchenette on the ground floor. And upstairs, at the top of a narrow wooden staircase, there was a single bedroom and a small bathroom. The whole place felt like a simple wooden cube tucked away in the middle of the forest. Modest, compact, and completely surrounded by trees. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, started a fire in the stove, made some coffee, and just listened to the quiet. Snow kept falling in that slow, steady way that makes everything feel insulated. And by the evening, I was relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in months. If you had asked me that night whether I felt safe, I would have said yes, without hesitation. The second day was still calm, but there were small moments that stuck with me afterward. I went outside in the morning to grab some firewood I'd stacked near the porch, and I noticed there were no tracks around the cabin besides mine from the day before. That was reassuring, and at the same time it made the place feel even more isolated. Later, when I was inside reading, I heard what sounded like a light knock. Not on the front door exactly, but somewhere deeper in the cabin, like wood shifting behind a wall. It happened once, then stopped. I stood there listening, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. Cabins make noises in winter, especially when the temperature drops at night. So I told myself it was nothing, and honestly, it probably should have been nothing. However, by the end of the day, I could have sworn I caught a faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air. That immediately put me on edge, because I don't smoke, and I'm usually pretty sensitive to that kind of smell. It was so subtle that I started doubting myself almost right away, telling myself it could have been something else entirely. Maybe the wood stove, maybe the cold air mixing with the scent of old wood. By the third day, though, I couldn't ignore this low-level tension that had settled in my chest. I wasn't panicking, and I wasn't seeing anything unusual, but I kept feeling like I was slightly out of sync with the space, like the cabin wasn't as empty as it looked. I checked the locks, which I hadn't done the previous nights, and I even glanced under the bed in a half-joking way, almost to prove to myself that I wasn't turning into someone paranoid. That night I fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't the deep, restful kind of sleep I'd had before. It felt light, fragile, like I could wake up at any moment. And that's exactly what happened. I opened my eyes to a sound that didn't belong in a quiet room. It was subtle at first, almost like fabric brushing against wood. And because I was still half asleep, I wasn't sure if I'd dreamed it. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, and it was coming from directly beneath me. I've never felt my body go that still. It was like every muscle locked at once. My heart started racing so fast it actually hurt. And I remember thinking, no, that's not possible. But the sound came again. A slow, deliberate shift, like someone adjusting their weight. I reached for my phone on the nightstand without taking my eyes off the ceiling, because I was too afraid to look down. The idea of swinging my legs off the bed and placing my feet on the floor felt impossible. Instead, I moved sideways, inch by inch, until I could push myself away from the edge. Then, in one quick motion, I slid off the mattress toward the wall, keeping my feet clear of the space directly below. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone when I turned on the flashlight. I crouched just enough to angle the light toward the darkness under the bed, and for a split second I hoped I'd see nothing but empty floorboards. But there was a man lying flat against the ground. He was so close to the floor that at first he looked like part of the shadow, but then the light caught his eyes and they reflected back at me. He wasn't moving, and he wasn't speaking. He was just staring straight at me, like he'd been waiting for that exact moment. Everything after that happened fast. I grabbed the keys that were still in the bedroom door, stepped out into the hallway, and locked him inside the room before he even had a chance to react. I didn't wait to hear if he was coming after me. I just turned and rushed down the stairs as quickly as I could, nearly losing my balance, and headed straight for the front door before throwing it open and running out into the freezing night. I don't even remember grabbing my coat properly. I just knew I had to get out. I ran into the snow and didn't stop until I reached the tree line. I had brought a satellite phone because I knew the area had no signal, and I've never been more grateful for a decision in my life. I called the police and tried to explain where I was. They told me it would take time because the roads were difficult, but they were on their way. So I stayed hidden among the trees, watching the cabin the entire time, convinced that at any second the door would open and he'd step out into the snow looking for me. The cold was brutal, the snow coming down without mercy, but the rush of adrenaline and the shock had taken over. All I could think about was the police getting there. I considered going back to the car, but I was afraid I'd lose my way in the snow, so I stayed where I was. It took about 2.5 hours for them to arrive. When they did, I walked back with them, pointed to the bedroom, to the exact spot under the bed. They searched the entire cabin, every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. He wasn't there. The door was still locked from the outside. The windows were closed and intact. There was no obvious way out, no broken panels, no trapdoors, nothing that made sense. The officers looked at me in that careful way people do when they don't want to outright say they doubt you, but you can tell they're considering it. I filed a report anyway. I also filed a complaint about the cabin and the owner, not because I could prove he had anything to do with it, but because the whole situation felt wrong from the beginning. The low price, with the vague communication. He refunded my money almost immediately, and as far as I know, the investigation never went anywhere. It's been 2 years now. I still think about those first few days, about that subtle feeling that something wasn't right long before I had proof. And what unsettles me most isn't even the image of him under the bed. It's the fact that he had to have been there for at least some time. Which means that while I was reading, cooking, sleeping, trying to relax, I wasn't alone the way I thought I was. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear the house settle or the floor creak, I don't think about ghosts or anything supernatural. I think about how easy it is for someone to be closer than you realize, and how your instincts sometimes know it before your mind is ready to accept it.